Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Musically Speaking, featuring the work of Johann Sebastian Bach and his B Minor Mass. Today, I'm so excited to welcome in, of course, our resident historian, Teresa Neff, who'll be talking to us all things Bach B Minor. And then we have a special guest, Eddie Cipullo, who is a flute maker here in town. And so we're very excited to have him as well. As a reminder, the concert is this Friday and Sunday. So Friday, April 5th at 7:30 p.m. at Symphony Hall, and Sunday, April 7th at 3 p.m. And for those of you, I'll give a reminder at the end, but Teresa will be giving a pre-concert talk 45 minutes before each performance, and it's different than what you're going to hear today. So if you want even deeper knowledge of the B minor mass, come to those. Yeah, we're off and running. So the rehearsal started last night with Maestro Suzuki, and we're off and running with this week. So Teresa, I turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much. I will share my screen and all right, here we should go. This Mass is very different from perhaps other Masses that we might know of. And I just wanted to start with a little bit of what would be expected in terms of organization of movements. If we were going to a Mass by another composer, we'd expect a Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, and Agnus Dei. That is the kind of the Roman Catholic version. And the Mass Ordinary are the texts for each of these movements that do not change, right? So it doesn't matter if it's Easter or Christmas, no matter what the particular celebration, these texts remain the same. Bach and the Lutheran Church don't necessarily follow this exactly, and that leads to an interesting organization of the B minor Mass. So for example, the first two movements, what we think of as the Kyrie and Gloria, in the Lutheran tradition in Bach's time, they were referred to as the Missa. And those were the movements that were traditionally performed as part of a Lutheran service. The Credo, or what Bach called the Symbolum Nacium, the Sanctus, and the Agnus Dei, they were not performed as part of a Lutheran service. And so this Mass was never performed that we know of complete in Bach's lifetime. Other parts of it were performed, and we can turn our attention to composition order for this Mass. So Bach composed the Sanctus first, and it was done for Christmas, the Leipzig service in 1724. It was a standalone work. It was a little bit different than the version we hear in the B minor, but essentially the Sanctus was just simply taken from that 1724 Christmas piece. And then in 1733, Bach created the Missa, the Kyrie and the Gloria, and these he wrote for Dresden, a court that Bach was trying to kind of create closer ties with. He sent several Kyrie Gloria pairs to Dresden, and the pair that becomes part of the B minor Mass was one of them. And then there's kind of a lull. And in the 1740s, particularly the last 2 or 3 years of Bach's life, he turns his attention to the final three texts, the Creed, the Hosanna Benedictus, and the Agnus Dei, and Dona Nobis Pacem. And that leads, and I'm just going to step back one slide, to that organization of his B minor Mass. So not 5 sections, or as we think of with the Mass Ordinary, but really 4. And not something that would have been used in the Lutheran service, and not something he intended to be done in a Roman Catholic service as well. The organization of the Hosanna, the Benedictus, the Agnus Dei might preclude that, as well as some of the text in the Gloria. If we turn our attention a little bit to the Gloria, the image you see there is the cover page of Bach's manuscript, where you see it says Missa, 5 voices, And then we get the voices as well as the instrumental parts listed for us. The Gloria is a longer text. It's a hymn of praise, and Bach subdivides it into essentially 9 parts. And you can see how the chorus and solos passages are alternated, although not strictly alternated, right? And the center movement, the center movement of the Gloria is the Domine Deus. This is for 2 soloists, and that's the movement we want to focus on just a little bit this evening. It is a movement after the opening praise of the Gloria in Excelsis. We have this text that talks about God the Father and God the Son. And here Bach takes the 2 voices, soprano and tenor, and he has them first in imitation, so first separately, and then he brings them together, even as they are singing about the texts of God the Father and God the Son. So kind of bringing together the theology of this text into a musical manifestation as well. But all of this is introduced by an instrumental passage, and that is features the flute and the violin. And so I'd just like to play a little bit of this opening, and then we'll jump a little bit so that we can catch the entrance of the voices. And then I'm just going to jump a little bit so that we can find our introduction to the 2 vocal parts, and we can hear how the imitations come together. And we might also notice how Bach uses the flute and the instrumental parts as almost a kind of ritornello, right? Lines to complement and alternate with the lines for the vocal soloists. The use of the flute here, I think, is really incredibly beautiful. It gives us a sense of the kind of new style that was around at this time in the middle part of the 18th century, something that was referred to as the galant. And Bach is using that kind of galant style and putting it up against older styles of writing throughout this mass. And one place that I think is really beautiful is how he takes us from the end of the Domine Deus and brings us into, he simply elides the end of the Domine Deus and the beginning of the next chorus, which is Qui tollis peccata mundi. And I'm just going to play the very opening of this next movement. You'll hear the switch. It works beautifully in live performance, not so well perhaps on Zoom. But the next thing to listen for is the flute, because it comes in, it kind of just sneaks in, quite frankly, and it adds this incredibly beautiful complexity to what is already now a rather complex chorus. So here's the transition and the opening of the Qui tollis. For me, that's just a wonderful way in which Bach connects these two movements. Yes, he physically connects them, but he's also connecting them through the use of the flute as well. This instrument is something that is referred to in Bach's time as the traverso. That's how he refers to it on that title page of his manuscript. And it's very different, I think, from the modern flute. And we are very lucky to have Eddie with us today, who can tell us more about the Baroque flute. I know, Eddie, when we were talking earlier, you said something so incredibly beautiful about how the flute complements the voice. And I think that's something that Bach is really doing here in these two movements. Also in the Benedictus, he'll do that again. But can you tell us more about this instrument and how it works?
Yeah. So certainly in the Domine Deus movement, for talking about the B minor mass, Bach is a really excellent writer for the flute. And what you hear it doing in that movement is, I think, he's writing almost in, he's using almost the entire range of the instrument. And yet he doesn't really go into any places or write in any ways that are hard to control, even though it's definitely a part that requires some stamina. And that's a really that's a real balancing act. And so he's really I think he's showing off a little bit of what the Baroque flute can do, which makes that a really interesting movement. I guess to explain a little bit of how the Baroque flute works, would it be fair to talk very briefly about the modern flute?
Sure.
And then sort of compare? Yeah, so the modern flute, it was sort of born out of the Industrial Revolution. It's an instrument usually made out of metal, though some of the first concert flutes were made out of wood. But it has a system of keywork and a lot of holes that are really large. It's sometimes difficult to explain how a flute works, because when you play it, you don't see anything vibrating. And that's almost never the case on an instrument. If you pluck a string on a guitar, like, you can see the string vibrate, like, you know how that works. But a flute is kind of magical. Like, there's nothing that visibly vibrates. But it's helpful to think about the holes on a flute as frets. They're like the frets on a guitar, and the column of air inside the flute is kind of like the string. And so the concert flute was born out of this craze of invention of makers trying to solve the problem of intonation in their words. That's sort of the phrasing that they would have used. But I take issue with this phrasing. I'd say that the concert flute makes a lot of decisions about intonation for the player that the player has to accept. So if you look at a modern concert flute, you can sort of think of it as like a fully fretted instrument. We have giant holes. We have one hole for every chromatic note. And we have a basically cylindrical bore. We have a straight string, a sort of a simple shape. The Baroque flute is really complicated because you have 6 smaller holes and 1 key. This is one of many different kinds of Baroque flutes, but this is essentially what you're looking at if you're looking at a Baroque flute. So it has fewer holes. The holes are smaller. We have a less emphasis on keywork, and yet the music isn't less chromatic. And that's sort of where the complexity comes in, because suddenly we need to get a lot out of this design. So to do that, makers change the shape of the bore. So the bore is not cylindrical, it is tapered. So it starts like, if I open the flute up, you can see it's really big at the end of the head joint, but by the bottom of the foot, it's quite small. Even though on Zoom, it sort of looks the same size. But that change so that taper helps the intonation because the holes are smaller. A smaller hole, it doesn't precisely form a node of the wave in the way that a really big hole does. Like a big hole is sort of like putting your finger down on a string on a violin. A smaller hole is like half covering it, you know? So it's, so the taper in the bore helps with the intonation across the octaves. And the Baroque flute has the difficulties of playing an instrument that has fewer frets. But what it gives you is a sound. It gets a really compelling color, and it gives you a lot of flexibility. So the musician has the control over intonation and sound in the way almost that a violinist has control over intonation and sound, or maybe a French horn player. So I think it's interesting to think about the difference between the modern flute and the Baroque flute, because both of them have two very valid but very different perspectives on tuning, music making, and it's helpful to put them side by side. Yeah.
Let me just jump in really quick to remind the audience that we do have the Q&A in place. So if you have a question, feel free to pop that question in the Q&A and we'll try to address those. One question that has come up in the Q&A, Eddie, is what is the range of the Baroque flute? And I guess, how does that compare to the modern flute?
The range is smaller. This was another, so I think part of the attraction of the modern concert flute is that the range is enormous. I think it's around 4 octaves. And that gives, artistically, that presents some real opportunities. And, you know, it's what you see in modern flute music, especially like contemporary flute music will go easily into the 3rd register, if not the 4th. And if you're a professional concert flutist, you have to know those fingerings. The Baroque flute has a range of 2 octaves and a 5th. So it goes from low D to D1, D2, and then it goes up to an A. If you're really feeling crazy, you could probably squeeze out a high B flat, maybe a C. But those are probably notes that you would only play for other flute players, you know? Yeah. So the range is smaller. That's another compromise that it's making. Or I guess to turn it around, that's something that the concert flute accomplishes through the use of like key work and adding these holes. Really, it has more holes. Yeah.
And when we talk about like the Baroque flute itself, I mean, one of the discussions that we're having is pitch. And one of the ways that we know or that we've learned about the different Baroque pitches is through extant instruments from specific regions. And Bach, when he first arrived at Leipzig, you know, the wind instruments, from what I had researched, there was 3 different standards of A, right? In the wind instruments, Tiefkammerton, which is A-2, and then A-1, and then A 0. So, you know, that gives us some variety. Talk to us about the kind of the variability in kind of a pitch standard for the Baroque flute.
That's a really good question. So a lot of the original, well, pitch varies depending on the original, obviously, depending on where it's from. Germanic instruments from like the early 18th century, if we're taking like the 1720s to the 1750s, I think you find a lot of instruments around 408, A400. In order to change the pitch of the flute, there is this thing called the corde de rechange. This was an invention that came out of France. And a corde de rechange is a collection of centers. So I have a different Baroque flute here that I can kind of demonstrate with. So this flute is in 4 pieces, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So they come apart. This center would be one of several centers that were different lengths, and you could exchange one center for another to affect the pitch. Now, what I don't know is if that answers the question about changing the pitch by as much as a half step. That would be a very extreme change to make. And there is always, in an instrument with a corde de rechange, there's always going to be one that works best. The flute, especially the Baroque flute, it is quite a flexible instrument. And that's what allows a corde de rechange to kind of work, even if it's not acoustically perfect. But there's going to be one that the instrument sort of really feels its best at. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but the corde de rechange would have been like the way that a flutist would have changed pitch, but if they didn't own multiple flutes. But that is probably another solution to that.
Yeah. Right. Now you are a Boston-based flute maker.
Yeah.
Yes, and so how long does it take to make a Baroque flute?
That's a good question, and it's one that we get a lot, and it's one that I don't have a great answer for. So at Von Huene, flute making these instruments is tied up in a lot of other work that we do. So we make instruments, and we also do repairs. We'll service instruments that come in that people want to sell secondhand. And so extracting purely, and sometimes sometimes the machine breaks in our workshop that we need to fix. And so extracting like the amount of time that it takes to make a Baroque flute can be difficult. But if someone placed an order for an instrument that we did not have in stock, I think we would ask them to wait like 6 months. So that's a long time. If you really wanted to, you could probably make a flute in a couple days, but I don't think that's a great idea because, well, as long as wood is your medium, you have to give that material a lot of time, or ideally you give wood some time to adjust every time you operate on it, because as you work with it, as you turn it, you're exposing new layers to the atmosphere, to the moisture and humidity, and it will start to shrink a little bit, even if it's been in our basement for 50 years. And that's sort of the idiosyncrasy of working with wood. So we like to do our best to take some time in between steps. And we use that time to work on other instruments as well. So we have instruments at every stage in production all the time. So I guess the answer is it doesn't need to take a long time, but if you work slowly, you will probably get a better or a result that will last longer. Yeah.
So we have a question from the audience here is what type of equipment is used to make your Baroque flute, or even, I guess, to service them as well?
Yeah. So methods vary from place to place, but I have some tools here that I can use to sort of explain how we make them at Von Huene. And the way that Von Huene thinks about instrument making has, of course, had an influence on the way that I think about instrument making. So let's take the bore of the Baroque flute or a recorder as an example, because the column of air inside the instrument is the thing that vibrates and sort of creates the sound. The shape of that column, so the shape of that taper, becomes really important. And if you're going another step to try and make a copy of an instrument, if you're trying to copy a historical instrument, copying the shape of that particular taper becomes important to capturing the sound in some way. And so the tool that you would use to do that is a reamer. And so this is an example of one. This is a reamer that you might use to ream part of a Baroque flute. And it sort of looks like a drill bit, except it has a taper to it. And we would use this reamer by actually placing this in a lathe, which will spin this reamer around, and then manually we push a piece of wood onto it that has had a whole board. So you might use a tool like this to, do the bore for a part of the flute that looks like this. But at Von Huene, we have even more dedicated custom tools in this genre. So this is actually not a reamer that we use in production. What we use looks something like this. So this is a reamer for a heart piece, for a piece of our flute. And the reason we're using this instead of this reamer is because we've included a step on this reamer that allows us to cut the socket of the heart piece and combine it into one step. So if I was using this reamer, I would have to cut that socket in a separate step, which would take a lot of time. And so through design, by designing these tools, we have the ability to sort of make our job easier or streamline something, even in like a handmade context. And it depends on the needs of the maker. It depends on what the maker enjoys doing. For instance, cutting the socket evidently is not something that someone enjoyed doing very much. So they decided to make a tool that would sort of take that challenge out of the equation for them. And similarly, there are people who might not enjoy turning the outside of an instrument. And so they might outsource that or design some tool to do that for them. But there are always going to be makers, and I know makers like this who love, turning an instrument by hand, and they never give that part of the process up. Even something like making a tool, like these tools, I have a tool here that was signed by Leon Beha. It says LJB 1975. So this was made by someone who enjoyed making tools enough to sign their name on a tool that they made. I'm not that person. But there are lots of different parts of the process that different people might find meaningful. And the tool set that you choose is a reflection of that.
All right, Eddie, we're running short on time, but we have a couple questions. So here's we're something new here for Musically Speaking, the speed round. So here's a quick answer this as quickly as you can. What is the ideal wood for a Baroque flute? I
don't know. That's a good question. We make most of our instruments out of boxwood. Okay.
Well, that's good. I mean, because obviously, like stringed instruments, maple.
There's no ideal wood. No.
Okay. Is playing the Baroque flute completely different from playing a modern flute? I say completely different is, I guess, the key, but it is, isn't it?
Yeah, it gives a modern flutist the experience of what it's like to play French horn. That's that's what it's like.
Except they can't shove a fist in there to kind of,
right.
maybe a pinky into the end. Does that work?
Yeah. Well, it's not a coincidence that like a Baroque flutist does vibrato with their hand, which is the way a violinist
Yep.
does vibrato. Like the relationship is that direct, you know,
Yeah.
which is different than on the concert flute for sure.
And I loved how you explained, you know, the column of air and the frets and creating nodes. And it does remind me so much of string playing, and how a
Yeah.
string player would play that either with frets like a gamba or with
Mhm.
Baroque cello, like you see back there. So last question, I guess, with the Baroque flute, the color of the Baroque flute is much more mellow, much more rounded, I would say, than the modern flute, which has cut to it.
Yeah.
And it perhaps, you know, matches better with the voice and with the strings, particularly, you know, strings with gut strings on them, versus metal strings. You know, is there like, you know, a bigger difference between, you know, the way that we kind of think about it as a flute player playing a Baroque flute in a historically informed performance, versus a modern performance of Bach?
Um, as in, like, do we think about like the instrument's relationship to the human voice? Is that
Yeah, yeah,
part of your
and
question?
yeah, and how it kind of melds into the ensemble, in an ensemble like H+H versus a modern version.
Um, that's a really good question. I think that in Baroque music, at least in like orchestral ish music, it's used a lot as a color.
Mhm.
Whereas, I mean, if you like the flute parts that John Williams writes for flutes might as well be violin parts, you know? I think the range is much more yeah. I think the flute is used in a much more uh violin like way for yeah. You don't see a lot of modern flute music uh, in orchestral context that uses like the really low register. It's
Mhm.
usually like second octave. It's sort of up high. Um, but that's I think that's different in Baroque music. You feel a lot more of like the color of like the low registers.
And that's in many ways it matches then it more closely matches the registration of a human voice. Whereas, you know, and when we talk about modern orchestration, the way that you know, we're taught in orchestration is, you know, this is a color that you layer on top and it's something that kind of sticks out above. Whereas here it's a color that is still part of the kind of overall fabric. It's not something that you use to extend the range necessarily, but something that kind of sits in the range of the piece itself.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah, that's a good point. And I feel like I heard that in the second excerpt that Teresa played for us, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Eddie, this has been great. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. We can stay
Thank
here for
you.
another couple of hours, and ask you more questions about the Baroque flute. But a great chance to hear the Baroque flute in action is on Friday and Sunday at Symphony Hall, for Bach's B Minor Mass, conducted by Masaki Suzuki. It is Friday, April 5th at 7:30 p.m. and Sunday, April 7th at 3 p.m. Come 45 minutes early to hear Teresa give you more information about the Bach B Minor Mass. And then you'll have a great concert. If on Sunday and only on Sunday at 2 p.m., you can see a pre-concert performance by the Handel and Haydn youth choruses. So that's right before Teresa. So go to Higginson's at 2, then go see Teresa, and then catch a concert. So you can make Sunday an all-day H&H day for you. But Eddie and Teresa, thank you so much for your time today, and thoroughly enjoyed this conversation and looking forward to hearing the concert.
Thank you so much.